My Berkeley Judicial Institute colleagues and I, and that includes now 2 wonderful interns who've joined this call, welcome you. We really value your time, and so we're grateful that you spent this time with us. The Berkeley Judicial Institute was created to connect, to bridge the judicial world with the academic world. It's hard for me to imagine a program that better takes those issues on. And while I'm very excited about our faculty, I'm also very excited about our audience. Good group of people. We're so grateful to have you here. A quick advertisement for Berkeley Judicial Institute before we start. If you check the chat function, you'll see a link to our website, to our LinkedIn profile, to our Twitter feed, to our mailing list. And in a ridiculous advertisement, should you join our mailing list, you might win 2 gavel pencils, judicial swag. You can't say that for every Zoom you participate in. So we'll move from the ridiculous to the sublime and start today's discussion, which is on judicial temperament. Judge and Berkeley Judicial Institute Executive Director Jeremy Fogel will moderate the discussion. He served on the state and federal courts in California and served as director of the Federal Judicial Center, which is the education and research arm of the federal courts, from 2011 to 2018. He'll be talking to Vanderbilt Law Professor Terry Maroney. Professor Maroney is the Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt. And her work, which all of you know is quite awesome, focuses on the role of emotion in the law. If you want to know more about the 2 of them, first, I promise it's an exhausting research study, but their biographical links are also in the chat. So with that, we'll turn things over to Judge Fogel. Judge Fogel, what will we talk about today?
Thanks very much, Denise, and thanks to you and to Natalie and to everyone at BJI for making this part 2 of our Judicial Temperament series possible. We started out with the goal of trying to tease out from the really wonderful work, the groundbreaking work that Professor Maroney has done, how judicial temperament differs from other concepts of how judges behave, judicial behavior or judicial demeanor, or the things that judges experience. And the premise of the law review article that Professor Maroney wrote for the Boston College Law Review was simply that we all talk about judicial temperament when we talk about judges, but there really hasn't been a careful, disciplined academic study of what judicial temperament is. It's kind of in the category of we know it when we see it. And it came up, as she points out in her article, in the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, that there was a lot of commentary about judicial temperament and whether Justice Kavanaugh did or didn't have good judicial temperament. And in that debate, it was a realization that we really didn't have much of a definition of judicial temperament. We could talk about traits that we thought were good things for judges to have and traits that we thought were not such good things for judges to have. But temperament is a term of art, and it's a term that in other fields outside of the judiciary has been studied at great depth and detail. Temperament is a focus of psychology. It's a focus of early childhood education. There's a lot of areas where people have thought about temperament very deeply. And what Professor Maroney has done, and I think it's just really quite remarkable, is use some of the approach, some of the concepts of that other work and bring it into the world of judges and the judiciary. So before we get into where we're going to go today, at the end of our session that we did last month, the first part of this series, there was a lot of questioning on the chat. Okay, well, now we understand better what judicial temperament is. What can we do about our behavior? How can we be the kind of judges that we want to be? And before we go to that conversation, I think it'd be useful to review just the foundations of what Professor Maroney is talking about. So Terry, why don't you take us through a relatively short version of what you've written in your article?
Great, I will. Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. And as Judge Fogel has said, if we had quite a long conversation in part 1, which I hope a lot of people have had a chance to watch about the theoretical fundamentals of what we're talking about when we talk about judicial temperament. But there was a lot packed in there. So even if you've watched that, we thought it would be helpful to have a bit of a distillation of those fundamentals. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it, to give you a bit of a crash course. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I also want to say, if people have questions while Judge Fogel and I are walking through this distillation of the fundamentals, please do pop them into the chat, and they can get elevated to us. Let me share. And there we go. Hoping everybody can see that. So what I want to do again is just catch everybody up so that we can have the most fruitful discussion coming forward. So the fundamental point to start with, Judge Fogel's already nodded to, which is I think it's very, very important to treat judicial temperament as a psychological construct and not just a legal one. In fact, I think it is both of those things, which is why I've proposed a psycho-legal theory of temperament. And the visuals I've given you here are just to give you a taste of the kinds of things I'm trying to stitch together. I'm trying to stitch together what it is we think on the law side of the equation, what we think judicial temperament is, and what we think we want from our judges that we think displays good temperament. And because that legal concept of judicial temperament has always been so fuzzy and mysterious and under-theorized, what I've tried to do is go to ground, essentially, and say, okay, what is human temperament? And if judges are humans first, what can we learn about human temperament that we can take this sort of laundry list of things we seem to want from our judges that we've chosen to call temperament and say, where does that come from? Right? So this is very much a trying to go to ground using some of these examples of the psychology of temperament. There's 2 points I want to make at the beginning, though, which is that temperament is only part of what we want in a judge. And I think this is, again, something that the psychology helps us. It helps keep us on the law side from thinking of temperament as a huge fuzzy concept that folds every single thing into it. It is not. It is part of what any given judge brings to the table. And part of what any given judge brings to the table is also intellect, motivations, ideologies, training, work habits, goals, right? So we want to think the way a psychologist would about temperament as just one part of what any given human being brings to any given situation. And the thing that is temperament is separate from intellect, from training, and from ideology. Now, those things combine into a single unique human being, but that human being, all of us, are subdividable in a way. And so when we're talking about temperament, I want us to be looking only at temperament. So here comes the crash course. So again, the starting point being that human temperament is what we're looking at first, and then we're going to see how that maps onto the judicial role. So this is a distillation of centuries of research and thousands of studies. So, but I think it nicely captures, again, the fundamentals. So the first point here is that if we're talking from a developmental psychology perspective, temperament is the dispositional traits that are moderately heritable, meaning we are born with them and they are traceable to some line of inherited biology, that characterize us differentially, meaning we are all born with a different constellation of traits. Those traits, again, that are at the absolute ground level that we regard as temperamental, can be divided into 2 broad categories, and within that 3 ultimate categories. The first category is often called reactivity or emotional reactivity, and they can be further subdivided within reactivity to negative emotionality and positive emotionality. So that's kind of on one side of things. And then the second is sometimes called effortful control and sometimes called self-regulation, exact same idea. So if we look at, for example, babies and small children, and anybody who's had more than one child probably has marveled at the fact that two children from the exact same biological sources have come out very, very different people from the get, right? So that is temperament. And the primary axes on which people divide trait-wise are about their propensities towards negative emotionality and positive emotionality, and their relative flexibility and strength in effortful control. So think of this as like your raw material. The raw material in any given human being then interacts with our environment, right? And this is a lifetime of our family dynamics, our life experiences, our society and cultural norms, what's expected of us, what's not allowed to us, what we morph ourselves into being given the environment that we are in. And after we go through a very long maturation process, we basically end up as adults with a relatively stable set of dispositional traits, right? Now we're going to be lots of other things too, and we'll touch a little bit later on a fuller concept of human personality. But one way to think about our adult personalities is that some portion of our adult personality profile is rooted in temperament. Not all of it, but a whole lot of it. And those dispositional traits that we carry with us in adulthood are going to have some traceable roots in the way we started out as morphed by our environments. A few other points here, and then I'm going to pause, Judge Fogel, and see if you want to clarify or ask any questions about this. But on the note of maturity, so if we think of, again, from a baby to an adult, there is just an enormous amount of growth and change and maturation happening here for us to get to our dispositional adult traits. But it doesn't stop there. What it does is it kind of slows down, it narrows, it flattens. But we should never think of ourselves as being set in stone. Like one metaphor that people sometimes use are these are the building blocks. This is the chisel, and this is the statue that we end up as adults. But we're not statues. We're still kind of like movable figurines, right? And we're malleable. So you might think of it as like, I don't know, silly putty and some kind of spatula, and then we're in this pretty firm but kind of soft. We've still got some growing to do, and there are predictable maturational patterns even with the relative stability of adult traits. That's a huge amount of distillation. Let me just pause there, and Judge Fogel, see if you have anything to add or ask.
Only that I think what you're saying, and what, again, people outside of the legal world take as a given, is that, you know, people are different for a lot of reasons. It's not just that people come from different backgrounds and have different life experiences, but people start off in different places. What you come into the world with a set of traits and dispositions and reactions, and they don't predestine you to be any particular way, but they enable and they also limit who you can become.
Correct.
You can't become somebody who's completely out of sync with your native temperament without, you know, having brain surgery or something, or just traumatic.
No, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And it is a true thing that all of us walk through our lives, particularly once we're adults and we've reached that relative plateau. We walk through our lives with characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that tend to hold often across situations, and that will reliably differentiate us from other people, right? So two people, same situation, different behaviors, right? Temperament is one of the contributors to that kind of differential. So yes. Right,
but I think you're going to talk about this next. They know that it's a starting point. It's not an ending point. And,
correct.
You know, there was a lot of interest from the judges who listened to us last time. Said, okay, this is very helpful to know about temperament, to know who I am, and so on. But, you know, I want to be able to conform my behavior to a certain set of aspirations and goals. So I know we're going to go there, but there's an intermediate step
Yeah,
which you're going to talk about now.
I
So,
am.
yeah.
Great. This is our absolute starting point in the developmental psychology, right? So, and again, let's always remember that there's other aspects of the adult individual, our motivations, our ideologies, our education, our values, etc., that are not rooted in temperament, but will combine, with our temperament-rooted personality structure to create us as individuals. So here's our starting point, right? So how do we then carry that forward and map this onto judges and judicial temperament? So there's our carryover, right? So just everything that I said in the previous slide, just know that it's the starting point here. So we've got the adult person who is now a judge or in a position to become a judge. And so we're going to be looking at this adult judge person's dispositional traits. And notice that we're still, those aspects of our adult personality that root in our original temperament can still be broken down into the same rough cuts, right? We're still looking for where do we sit on a trait continuum of low to high for negative emotionality, which is, again, a propensity for anger, contempt, frustration, fear, anxiety. Those are sort of our big ticket items there. Or positive emotionality. So there we'd be looking at propensities to feel pleasure, satisfaction, joy, excitement. Very closely related is kindness, propensity to feel compassion, empathy, what I would like to call agape, a general sense of people are good, people are worthwhile, I love humanity. And then emotion regulation, which is the adult instantiation of our effortful control traits as a child. So what is our flexibility with regulating our emotions in a given situation, and what range of tactics do we have to help us manage these emotions in real life, right? So any given judge is going to walk into a judicial environment with some constellation of these traits, right? Perhaps very high in negative emotionality, very low in positive emotionality and kindness, perhaps moderate in emotion regulation. You can imagine almost any combination, right? So then that judge is going to interact with a work environment. And one mistake I think we make very frequently in law is thinking of judging as just one thing, where all of you who are judges know that it's not just one thing at all. There's many different ways of being a judge, and those things are quite different. They're going to react differently and interact differently with the traits that you bring to that situation. So when we're looking at the interaction of trait with environment, you want to look at what kind of judge are you? Again, rough cut. Are you a trial judge? Or are you an appellate judge? Are you an intermediate appellate judge? Are you in a state system, a federal system? Are you on a criminal docket or are you on a probate docket, right? There's just so many different variables there. What's the pace of work in your judicial environment? Do you have time to really sort of noodle over things, or are you in a fast pace, in and out kind of court, or somewhere in between? Is it sometimes one and sometimes the other? What are the unique stress features of your job, right? All judging is stressful in some ways and often in similar ways, but the stress features of any particular judicial environment are going to be different, right? What are the supports that do or do not surround you? Do you have colleagues? Do you have access to friendly colleagues? Do you have access to honest feedback? Do you have clerks? Can you rely on your clerks? Who do you have in your life that you can talk to about your job, right? Do you have access to leave if you need it? Are you isolated? Do you like isolation or do you hate isolation? If you hate isolation, can you get support when you need it? What's your security situation? And I'm thinking of security as like job security, right? Do you face election every 8 years? Do you never face election at all? Do you have financial security? Are you paid well or not well? What's your physical security? Are you and your family in danger? How frequently, right? So this could go on forever, right? But I think it's very important to think about temperament as just being the thing that one carries into this situation, and the situation does every bit as much work as the traits in driving behaviors, right? So once we have these two things in constant dialectic, behaviors happen. And again, a lot of people think of the work of judging as just deciding cases, figuring out what the law is, deciding what sort of facts to credit and what not to credit. Obviously, that's an important part of judging. But we also know that the behaviors that we're talking about generally with temperament are not those behaviors, right? We're talking about demeanor, Judge Fogel, like you brought up. What kind of face of justice do you show to the world, to the people in your courtroom? How do you react when people talk to you? How do you react to what's going on around you in a courtroom or in chambers or in conference? What do you say? What do you say out loud? How do you write? What kind of emotions do you express in your words? How do you interact with lawyers? How do you interact with subordinates? How do you interact with colleagues? And also what's going on inside of you? Are you a ruminator? Are you somebody who overworks? Do you overeat? Do you neglect yourself and your family? Or do you do the opposites of those things? So again, the fundamental point, traits interact with environment to produce behaviors, and some of those are behaviors we want from judges, like having a calm, polite, and respectful demeanor, and some other behaviors we don't, like being very short-tempered, snappy, contemptuous, mean, and rude, right? Just to close this out, a couple of other really important things to think of here is we're always talking about goodness of fit between this and this. We're always talking about how well do your traits fit into your environment? How good is the fit between you and your environment? Temperaments are not by their nature good or bad. That's a fine piece of foam or whatever that is, right? It just doesn't work with the round hole, right? And then the last idea is this envelope of possibility. And the idea with the envelope of possibility is that, again, our traits are not completely fixed, and they're also not unidimensional. So whatever cluster of traits that any given judge carries into her environment, if there is a fit problem, and she finds herself, say, snappier than she would like to be in everyday court interactions than she thinks is proper, that doesn't mean she's stuck with it, right? All of us have within our temperament constellation sort of an envelope of possibility within which we can grow and change, but it is not infinite. That's the nature of an envelope. A lot can happen within it, but you're in it. And I'm going to quote here from the marvelous Jerome Kagan. I mentioned this quote in our first half, but I think it's worth repeating here. The wonderful metaphor that he offers is water, right? And the idea that condensed water vapor can, depending on local conditions, form a white billowy cloud, a mackerel sky, or a dense ground fog, but it cannot become an asteroid, right? So what we never want to do is expect a judge to become somebody she fundamentally is not and cannot reasonably become, right? The idea is maximizing your temperamental possibilities so as to maximize the fit with your environment, so as to maximize the chance of generating desired behaviors and not undesired ones.
Let me give a couple of examples here that I think will be relatable to the judges who are listening. And then we can move on and talk about, well, then what do you do with this information? What do you do with this framework? But actually, one of the stories involves a judge I knew some years ago when I was on the state court and I was doing family law. That was something I ended up doing a lot of when I was on the Superior Court in California. And this particular person who I knew, and all I'm going to say is that it was a guy who was another Superior Court judge somewhere in California, had a temperament that he was extremely meticulous. He loved the law. He was unfailingly polite. He was very formal. Um, and I would say empathy was not something that came easily to him.
Okay.
I would not say that he lacked empathy, but it was not something that, you meet this person and you would say, oh, he's just so empathetic.
Yeah.
Because what you got was the formality and the and the sort of precision thinking, and the somebody who would have been, to your point about fit, he would have been really good doing civil cases and
Right.
law in motion and things like that. And he was assigned to family in his particular court, and it was really tough.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to see the cases as legal problems, which of course they are.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's kind of the legal problem's the tip of the iceberg, and usually what's going on dynamically in those cases has got very little to do with the law and got a lot to do with what the people are feeling and what's going on between them and their relationships and so on, and their grief and their anger and all that. So empathy actually is a really useful skill if you're a family law judge, as long as you don't go too far and over-identify. So this person ended up having a really hard time handling a family law docket because it just isn't who he was, and it's not like he could
asteroid and a situation that called for a billowing cloud.
Billowing cloud, right? He could not manufacture it, and I'm not saying this in any way to be critical. I mean, I think very highly of this individual, but it was a bad fit.
Right.
Well, and the other example that comes to me, and it's one Terry, is it involved me. I mean, so I mean, I'm I've always had a mediative temperament. I mean, I part of that is just who I was born as, and part of it is my family history. But I'm somebody who, it's just interesting that I ever became a lawyer, because I'm always able to see both sides of the problem, and that's difficult when you're an advocate. But one year, our presiding judge assigned me to be the settlement judge for criminal cases, and which is in California, judges are allowed to do that. They're allowed to get involved in settlement. And, in some ways it was a really good fit, because I've always been good at settling cases. But what happened was that the human condition that I saw in the people who were coming through my courtroom every day, the facts of the crimes, right? No matter how, and the facts of the crimes and the circumstances of the people, no matter how hard I tried to say, hey, wait, you're just doing your job here. You just gotta move the merchandise, right? I couldn't. That I would see the pain that people were feeling. I would see the bad things that people did to each other. I would see the human tragedies, the suffering of the victims, and so on. And I could just feel over the course of the year, my equanimity was just draining away.
Yeah.
And I really was to the point of almost being depressed. It was just too hard to see that stuff every day.
Yep.
And so for me, that's not the best fit. That's not my highest and best use. And I'm glad I did it, because I learned a lot from doing it. But I think those are the kinds of things that experience teaches you. And if you're paying attention to your temperament,
right,
you kind of know, this maybe not this, maybe that.
Right, and it's such a good example, Judge, because you can have too much of a good thing, right? Like, as we discussed in the last session, our basic rules here are, in a judge, for us to get the desired set of behaviors, like patience, calmness, respect, compassion, boundaries, wellness behaviors. If we want to get all those things that we want very, very low levels of trait negative emotionality. We want relatively high levels of positive emotionality and kindness, and we want moderate to as high as we can get it emotion regulation capacity, right? But what you're describing essentially is compassion fatigue, right? Which the judge that you're describing before is not going to have a problem with compassion fatigue, right? His problem was more like, I can't engage, I don't naturally engage that empathic kindness, and that made that a bad fit for him, because that made him, in a lot of ways, from what you're saying, unable to fully grasp the nature of the work at hand and do it in a way that people would find to be respectful of them, right? The public and litigants and families probably experienced him in a way that left them without the greatest sense of, like, the courts are a place where I matter and where I'm attended to. Am I right?
That's exactly right.
That comes easily to you because you, I believe, are relatively high in the kindness trait. Now, the problem is, in the environment you're describing, being quite high on the kindness trait leaves you vulnerable to compassion fatigue. So this is a really, really great point, not just about goodness of fit, but also the idea that there's no such thing as like a purely good or a purely bad temperamental trait. What there is different temperamental constellations create different regulatory challenges in the work environment, right? So a regulatory challenge for you in that work environment was to figure out ways to combat your compassion fatigue, right? So for you to function well in that environment, given your temperament, sets up a very particular regulatory challenge that other judges don't have, because they're not interacting with it in that way. Does that make sense, Judge?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think it's really important to, there are people, and I know we're going to talk about this too, that their particular temperament makes almost any kind of judging really difficult for them, right? I mean, like, people have a hard time making decisions. I mean, that I've run into that one, and that can become really difficult. People who are excessively perfectionistic rather, can have a tough time being judges at all. People who have trigger tempers and are angry all the time, I mean, that probably is never going to fit. But I think for most people,
that last one is the one that is most temperamental in nature. Again, there's lots of other aspects of people that will make judging of any variety, like fish to water or like absolute oil in water, right? In temperament, again, is one of those. And the last one that you mentioned, like having a very quick anger trigger, tending to experience things in a way that makes you angry and then to react to them in a way that kind of fuels the fire and then gives you something more to be angry about, that's going to be hard for anybody. But again, certain work environments as a judge will buffer not just the judge from the worst impacts of that, but the public too. A trial judge with that temperament is going to be much more obviously problematic in more visible situations than an appellate judge. Not to say the appellate judge won't have problems, right? That person is likely to have extremely toxic interactions with colleagues, which is also bad for them and also bad for the courts, right? But it won't be visible in the exact same way. And they might, if they're high in regulation, they might be able to keep a lid on it most of the time because they're not in court every single day and they have lots of time and lots of space, and they might blow off steam with their clerks, and then they're nice to their colleagues, right? So again, these things interact in such an important way. But those are terrific.
Interacting. Forgive me, I'm going to pop in to say, first, I'm getting a lot of chat questions about how smart the two of you are. I'm totally taking that as something I did that you didn't have. That wasn't a trait that existed before we met. Questions about whether the slides will be available. I want to make sure that you promote your upcoming judicature work. 5 things, and then lots of questions about where do individuals fit in on these traits, and will we get more on that? And then looking forward, and this could be a 3rd program, what should appointment commissions be looking at when they look at judges? What are the kinds of questions that they should ask to get to these traits? But on that long list, the piece of where do individuals fit in the traits? How can they identify them? What can they know? High on the list of things.
I think that's where we're going right now, Denise. I think that's
perfect timing. Perfect timing.
Segment. And I do want to talk about that last question too, because it was really one of the things that motivated Terry to write her article. Was the
absolutely
the cabinet controversy. But go ahead, Terry. Let's talk about.
Shall we start here? Shall we start by? It sounds like, if I'm understanding the question or this cluster of questions, is now that we have it established that these are the types of traits about which we are most concerned right? Either concern positively or negatively. How might we figure out, either within ourselves if we're judges, or about other people, what kind of trait constellation they have? Have I got that right? Is that the
I
name?
think that's what people. How do you know yourself in
Yeah.
this framework?
Okay, so I'm going to do a thing that it moves me into borderline therapist territory, but let's use you as an example,
Wow.
Judge Fogel. How do you know who you are in this regard, right? There's 10 million things about you. This is a really important aspect of who you are. It's not the only aspect. But if you were trying to look at yourself honestly, what dispositional traits do you think you bring to the judge's role, and how do you know?
Okay. Well, I think you mentioned one. I think empathy, compassion, kindness. I think that is pretty strong in me.
And
And
can I ask you, like, just you as a human before you became a judge, would you have thought that that was true of you before you became a judge?
I think so. I
What was
think so.
evidence of that in your life?
It was the kinds of things I gravitated toward. I mean, it was the kinds of work I thought about when I was growing up. I mean, it was the people that I ended up liking and wanting to be around. Some people who know me know that I almost was a religious studies person and went into that field. And it's not because I'm particularly religious. It's because I was drawn to the idea of, for lack of a better word, pastoring or ministering. I mean, being there for people in that way. So it's always been a pretty strong part of my personality. And I was aware of that, I think, when I was pretty young. I think, so that's one I know. I mean, I think there's a side of that part of my temperament is I'm sometimes can be oversensitive, and that I can have a hard time with criticism. And it's something that I've spent most of my adult life working on and getting better at that. But and it's not that I react to it by lashing out at people, because anger is not something that comes into my professional life much. But I can end up feeling pretty down on myself. I can be very hard on myself. And that can be a real inhibitor. I can try to please people too much. I can put up with people who I don't really like, or who I don't feel particularly close to, but I'll just do it because I don't want them to not like me. And so there's that sort of like the flip side of the kindness and the compassion is that I don't always have that compassion for myself. And so, I'd say that dyad probably the most significant. I think I'm pretty patient. I think I have a hard time confronting people when I need to. I think sort of some of that ties into the needing to be liked, but I have a hard time delivering bad news. So, and
I gotta say that's hard for a judge, because a judge delivers bad news to
somebody. I mean, we deliver bad news every day, right? And so,
just to pause there for a second, that's a great example of, like, if there's a type of thing that's just hard for you on a very deep level, an emotional level, and it's the kind of thing your job requires of you on a constant level, again, that's a goodness of fit issue, but it's not a fatal goodness of fit, depending on how well you can regulate those difficult emotions, right? Which
exactly. So I can't not be compassionate. I'm just wired that way.
Right.
But I can be less self-critical. I can be straighter with people about negative stuff. I can take criticism less to heart. If it's justified, of course I take it to heart. But I mean, I think it's just the idea that somebody would be critical at all. And so it's like learning how to regulate that. That as a judge, I mean, it's one of being a judge was a good fit for me in a lot of ways because it forced me to do that. I mean, I was not as good a judge when I was unable to handle that regulatory stuff. I could be compassionate, but I mean, that's not all being a judge is. I mean, it's not just being compassionate.
Right.
So,
and in fact, very frequently, if you are high on the kindness domain of your temperament, that sets up, again, a very specific regulatory challenge. And it probably would have been the end of your judicial career if it were not within your envelope of possibility to strengthen your regulatory skill in that regard, right? But you found enough room within your regulatory envelope to be able to cultivate that ability to think about your role, to think about boundaries, to think about the long picture and not just why something feels uncomfortable to you now, right? So again, I want us to talk about regulation quite a good bit because it's one of the most important areas for judges to invest in.
One other, and that's exactly where I want to go too, is the one other thing I would say that was pretty critical, apart from just very, very supportive family and loved ones in my life, is that I've always been curious. And
okay.
I come to think that curiosity may be a temperamental trait. It's certainly a very well, it's not on the list, but
so let me actually hop ahead to let me actually just hop ahead to something here and show you guys this. So I wasn't sure if I was going to show this or not, but this is a good moment at which to show this. So notice that I've been talking a lot about temperament and the aspects of our temperament that form part of our full-fledged adult personality. Most Americans are much more familiar with the concept of personality than they are with temperament. And I bet if we were to do like a live poll of everybody who's with us right now in this webinar, a lot of people would know like their Myers-Briggs type. A lot of people know about the 5-factor model of personality, which is what this is that I'm showing here. So let me just say something about personality. So what you've just described, Judge Fogel, as curiosity would fit somewhere in the openness to experience factor in the 5-factor model of personality. And there's an element in which all of these, openness, conscientiousness, which before when you referred to your asteroid former colleague as meticulous, that would be an expression of conscientiousness. Extroversion, which incorporates aspects of like the high, the sort of high energy positivity, agreeableness, neuroticism. So the ones that are most clearly linked to temperament in terms of emotional reactivity and self-regulation or effortful control really are these 4. Conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I think most relevant to judges, really neuroticism and agreeableness as sort of rough proxies of what the grown-up versions of negative emotionality and positive emotionality and kindness are, right? Those spread across agreeableness and extroversion. So just again, to give a taste of where the work is going next is now that I've been kind of going to ground and working with the ground level stuff with temperament, is now opening that up and saying, okay, how can the tools of adult personality theory, which is sort of temperament grown up, help us understand that? So certainly your curiosity, it sounds like, Judge, or your openness to experience helps you or helped you as a judge deal with some of the situational downside effects of one aspect of your kindness. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to pop back to where we were. But I want to say a couple of things about that. One, I want to just thank you for that extraordinary kind of like bearing of the soul that you just did. And part of why I didn't tell you I was going to ask you to do that, but I'm glad you were game to do it, because for those of you who are watching who say, well, how do I know my own trait constellation? That's one of the ways you do it. Just literally ask yourself, what am I like in situations of, particularly situations of stress and minimal constraint? What are your go-tos? Do you tend to react to situations with anger or with fear or anxiety or with excitement or with pleasure? Do you tend to have to work at feeling compassionate towards somebody, or does it tend to flood you, or is it some other thing somewhere along that continuum? When you have an emotion that is getting in the way of your goals in a particular moment, or a bad fit with the environment that you're in or the behaviors that are expected from you, what do you do? How do you, are you very, very fluid in being able to change how you're appraising the situation, or to suppress a behavior because you know that it's out of whack with your environment? Or do you find that very effortful? Do you have like two techniques you use to regulate your emotions, and when neither of them works, you don't have any more? Or do you find yourself with kind of an infinite reservoir? Right. So this is one of the kind of perpetual bugaboos in personality and temperament research is a lot of it is based on self-report. And when you get to adults, most of it is based on self-report.
Let me just add a little bit to that, if I might. It seems to me with judges, you have a couple of unique challenges, and other types of people have similar challenges. But I think what I've noticed with judges is two things. One is that it's very hard to get honest feedback.
Yes.
Because the situation is very hierarchical, and so it's very difficult to get feedback from your staff or from the lawyers, people who appear in front of you. It's not always easy to get honest feedback from your colleagues because there's a kind of closedness that you don't want to look bad and kind of thing. It's you don't feel like it's safe or appropriate to right. show that much of yourself to a colleague, although there certainly are exceptions to that. But it's hard to get honest feedback there. Your loved ones, the people close to you in your life, can give you great feedback of the person that they see, but they're not with you in the courtroom. They're not doing the work with you, so that you don't really get it there. And so you have that difficulty, I think, getting honest feedback. And then the other one is, I think there's probably an abnormal number of people with perfectionistic tendencies who become judges.
Right.
And it's going to go to it's
hard to hear the feedback, even if you
right, exactly. I mean, that's one of the things I've always struggled with. I said I had a hard time with criticism, and it was because I'm a perfectionist. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and so the thing is, what gets you the gold stars, this goes to the selection process, we'll talk about maybe if we have time, but what gets you the gold stars is doing really well. It's what calls you to the attention of right. people who might encourage you to be a judge, or might evaluate you as a good judicial candidate. And so you kind of get to where you are in life, where you get to this position of honor and trust because you are really good at stuff. And so the idea that, you have failings, that you have weaknesses, that you have things that are hard to be honest about, it's very hard to do that if you're a perfectionist. So I think there's a constellation. You're not getting good feedback, and I think a lot of judges are perfectionists. So it's very difficult to have that sort of self-reflection mm-hmm. that allows you to say, well, okay, so this is the stuff that's baked in to my character or my personality or my temperament, and this is what I can do something about. This is
right. Yeah. That's right. And also to be able to pay attention to the environment, because again, both of them are doing a whole lot of work here in terms of spitting out behaviors. There can often be changes to your judicial environment that you might be able to enact to just make things less challenging, right? You might be able to change some of the stress features. You may be able to alter your culture a little bit so that maybe you could cultivate openness and open feedback and camaraderie among your colleagues, right? So I do want to resist us falling into the trap of saying, well, judging just is what it is, and it's all about the people we feed into it. It's partly the one and it's partly the other. It's the two in dialectic, right? But if you're looking at yourself, again, if we're measuring temperament in young children and babies, it's always observational, right? Because they can't report very well to you. an observation has some real upsides and some real downsides, and one of the downsides is bias, right? So, for example, you may be in a jurisdiction where you have an active judicial performance evaluation program, but you may not always trust the validity of the information you're getting because, you know, some of the people who are going to be evaluating you are lawyers who you just made really mad last week, or they may judge you because you're a woman, and any anger expression, even if a very measured one in a woman, might be perceived by others as being a poor demeanor, right? So there's distortions. So you want the feedback, but you want to be conscious of the distortions. Similarly, if you are going self-report, which is what we tend to do with adults, you know, you can go online and take all sorts of scales and sort of get an idea of what your personality traits are. You're not always the best judge of yourself either, right? So you want to triangulate these things. And so that is another place to make a good commentary about culture. Like if we could collectively cultivate a judicial culture that takes these issues seriously, then perhaps it wouldn't be so unthinkable to have judicial 360s. Like, you know, I've talked to judges in my interview study when I've asked them, for example, certain things about demeanor. I've had judges say, like, you know who you should really ask? You should ask my clerk or my deputy, because they know. I think I know, but I don't know. She knows. My deputy knows, right? And that's true. What if you could have, like, some jurisdictions have people come in and literally tape you in court? And then sit with you and do that very painful thing of you watching it with them, and they talk you through what they see, and you're like, gosh, I didn't realize I was scowling, or I didn't realize this, or I didn't realize that. So if we cultivated that kind of openness, like, we're all human, everyone's doing a really hard job, we'd all like to do better, let's enlist some help, right? On that note, we should talk very briefly, because I want us to talk about some of the other questions that Denise has posed. We should talk a little bit, Judge Fogel, about emotion regulation training. So let me just tee that up real quick. So we can budge these things in ourselves within our envelope of possibility, right? If you have a short trigger anger reaction, you can get better, but I can't tell you how much better you can get, right? Because I don't know any individual person's envelope of possibility, but everyone has one, right? So you know, Jerome Frank was famous in the 30s for saying that all judges should go into Freudian psychoanalysis. I'm not going to say that, but I am going to say a lot of pretty honest self-evaluation with help from whomever would be a useful mirror to you will help you figure out where your trouble spots are here, right? Everyone has trouble spots. So what is your envelope of possibility with improving your ability to regulate your go-to emotional patterns in light of your environmental demands so as to maximize the desirable behaviors, right? So this is probably the single best target for most judges to plow their energy into. Definitely understand yourself first, because if you don't, you can't do this at all. But that's a place where growth is real, and it's real possible, right? And I can't go into a huge amount of detail about it now. Again, that might be webinar number 3, just talk about regulatory capacity. But Judge Fogel, you and I have been doing this, again, for close to a decade, where we go out and we talk to judges about emotion regulation and try to help people get better. So I don't know if you'd like to say something about that.
Well, it is something that, I mean, as we've done this, it seems to me we probably just should plan on doing this again and focusing entirely on that.
Perennial webinar, but that's okay.
Right, because once you understand something about temperament and kind of what you're bringing to the party, and you understand how that has shaped your personality, and then you get some honest feedback and some real good self-appraisal about how you treat people and how you handle different kinds of situations, there actually is stuff you can do. I mean, it's not just waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to do better, although that's part of it. That's
the motivation. The motivation gives you the fuel to then acquire the skills.
But there actually are skills. And you know, we've, as Terry said, she and I have taught this together now probably to, to hundreds of judges, and it's not mumbo jumbo. It's like, it's very practical. There are very specific things you can do when you get angry, when you get disgusted, when you get burned out. I mean, there's things you can do to mitigate the effects of those experiences.
Yeah.
And I think the more judges understand that toolkit, the more they can apply themselves within their envelope of possibility. They can't grow traits they don't have, but they can certainly, expand the benefits of the beneficial traits they do have, and they can minimize the negative effects of the negative traits that they have.
So because it feels cruel to me to tell people there's lots of things you can do and not give you even the faintest idea of what they may be, let me just say a few. And I do think that maybe we should do a part 3 that's literally nothing but emotion regulation techniques, but they can be extremely simple, like the ability to put in interrupters between your emotion and your reaction, like time, 10-second breaks. It can be breathing, it can be mindfulness. So it can be very simple things like the break or the breath, or it can be extremely high level things like what we call cognitive reappraisal, where you essentially invest in a different narrative about what's happening. And investing in a different narrative about what's happening and what is important about what's happening allows you to funnel a different reaction into that situation. So that's kind of like the 2 poles of complexity. Take a breath and engage in a whole new story, but we can definitely walk people through that. So I think the perhaps one of the last things we'll have a chance to say in this iteration of the perennial webinar is really to engage seriously with this idea of how do we select judges. And Judge Fogel is exactly right that this is one of the things that really motivated me to do this work, because I found it intolerable to think that we use temperament as one of our entry conditions and as also one of our exit conditions. Like, people get booted from the profession because of temperamental failures, and they get gated in or out of the profession because of our perception of temperament. And I thought that's kind of crazy to have entry and exit conditions that we don't actually know.
And just to add a little bit to that, because I think if you read Terry's article, she starts out by talking about the Kavanaugh hearings and that gap in our cultural understanding. And I want to just emphasize it was not any sort of political side taking. It was just sort of there was a hole in our understanding of what happened there.
Right.
But I think, I was talking with a judge a number of years ago who was on an appointments commission in his state, and he said that they were looking for people's, did they have trial experience? Did they have intellect? Did they have, were they good lawyers? Were they?
That's this part. The other.
Were they professional? Were they ethical? But he said that and this was he was vetting people for an appellate position. Well, how do they get along with other people? How are they going to handle collegiality? How do they deal with people who they disagree with? What if the disagreement is actually something about something they care very personally about? I mean, how do they deal with situations? They didn't ask those questions. They didn't even think about them. And then when you look at people for the trial courts, although I think this is starting to change in some places, but if you're going to be going to a general jurisdiction trial court in a state where you're going to be doing probate and you're going to be doing juvenile, you're going to be doing family, you're going to be doing criminal, and somebody is looking at you, well, this person, has tried 10 civil cases and they did great and all that kind of thing. Well, how do they interact with people? I mean, how do they deal with intense emotion that's directed at them? I mean, what do they do when somebody attacks them? I think there's just so much to be learned about what people are bringing in these other dimensions of personality, and temperament is where it all starts.
Right.
So I'm not aware of too many judicial vetting processes where this is really as prominent as I wish it were. I mean, I think it's, to say that it's not considered is not fair. I think it is considered more in some places than in others, but I don't think it's
in a fairly ad hoc kind of way. But we also want to be very careful of going completely in the other direction, which is saying, here's, a particular personality profile that we're going to administer to prospective judges, and here's what a passing score looks like. That's not what we're going for. But just to give this, a fairly quick treatment, but you want to be looking for evidence of these kind of patterns if the person has not been a judge before, right? It's all predictive. So you want to look at evidence of these kind of patterns in environments that are as analogous as possible, right? Because even though our traits go with us wherever we go, they produce behaviors in interaction with environment. So if you want to look at, this person's been this kind of litigator or this kind of transactional lawyer, what are the things in their past that have some common features? Like, for example, high stress and minimal oversight, for example, the need to interact regularly with clients or the public, for example, like whatever are the features of the kind of judge they want to be, how did they predictably or in a patterned way act in those scenarios? Sometimes you have to make predictions based on incomplete evidence. In fact, I'd say always we're making predictions based on incomplete evidence. So some years ago, a controversy broke out about a Texas state trial judge whose daughter made public a video of him rather viciously berating and then physically beating her for something that he felt she had done wrong in the house. And that actually is the kind of debate we should be having. Like, that shows behavior under stress at a moment where he thought there were a few consequences and low visibility, right? That probably reflected something durable in his temperament, or at least that was the account of the daughter. Then the question becomes, is that so, right? Like, was that a pattern, or was it kind of a very aberrant one-off? And if it's a pattern, are there features of his life as a judge that would give room to roll for that kind of temperament in a way that will instantiate bad behaviors, right? So I don't pretend to say that this is elegant or this is easy to do, but at least it gives you something to talk about. Whereas usually what we do is like, well, that's terrible, he's terrible. Or he's not, maybe he's terrible, but that's his life, that's not his job. Like, those are not helpful conversations, right? It is a helpful conversation to say, what are the odds? What is the likelihood that the parameters of judging are going to interact with what we see in his temperament to produce behavioral outcomes that we think are bad for the world, right? Bad for justice, bad for perception of justice. That's what we need to do. Again, in 10 years, I hope I'll have a much better answer to this.
Yeah.
Of how we do that.
I think I'm just looking at one of the comments we got from the chat, and maybe we're going to probably need to close because we're up against our time. But this particular person was talking about rudeness toward non-traditional lawyers, in this case, women, people of color, and how widespread that is still. Even though we've come a long way.
Absolutely.
And rudeness to everybody. I mean, there certainly were judges I remember who were the equal opportunity blanks, toward anyone who appeared before.
Yeah, it can go both ways. I mean,
but
judges of color get terribly mistreated, and other judges mistreat lawyers, and yeah.
I do think, we need to take that one on too. I remember, and this is, this because we've talked about it, that when I never had any interest in being a judge, I was, kind of doing what I was doing. And I would go to court with my clients who, for the most part, were people who were suffering from mental illnesses of one kind or another. That's the work I did. And there were certain judges who were just horrible to them. They were horrible to me, but they were particularly horrible to my clients. And I remember saying, you know what, I can do a whole lot better than that. I may be a young lawyer without a lot of experience, but I can certainly treat people better than that person is. And I think, that is I talked to a number of other judges for whom that was a motivation. Those and maybe disproportionately, they've been judges of color and women, where it was sort of a negative experience,
right?
That kind of motivated them to want to become judges, because it was just such a a bad face for the justice system to have. So it really highlights the importance of focusing on temperament as part of the qualifications for a judge.
Absolutely. And, you know, the reality is that once people are judges, it's frightfully hard to get rid of them, no matter how bad the fit is. And, you know, that's a whole other, the exit conditions are also very different as across jurisdictions. Many of them are extremely unfair. Many of them, you know, reward, you know, some judicial elections reward bad behavior. Some judicial elections punish bad behavior because, you know, it sort of depends sometimes on who's, you know, whose ox is being gored. So this is a very complicated thing. And I guess, again, I've tried to distill the basics of this thing so that we can understand the concepts. But in doing that, I don't want to send artificial signals that this is simple, right? What's simple is what we've been doing, which is like, well, yeah, she's got it, or no, he doesn't have it. But it doesn't work. Right? So sometimes to do something that is correct and good and tracks the things that we want to be tracked and does it in a sophisticated way, right? That's hard, but that's what we are called to do, right? So I think, again, this is all just very ground level, build up from here. And I think eventually where we build up from here is working towards exit and entry and everything in between that is adequately reflective of what the temperament that, as you said, Judge Fogel, what judges bring to the party and what the party looks like, how the party goes, right? Like, how can we build environments that maximize the greatest potential of the greatest number of judges, given the expected range of temperaments, right? So I think that's a long-term project. I'm proud to be sort of working at the ground level of it, but I don't want any of us to think that the ground level is the penthouse either.
And I think
well, I will say, I don't think in any way you made this a simple issue for people. I think in your typical brilliant way, you made it a complicated issue more complex, more interesting. So thank you for that. For a pop quiz question, okay to share your slides with the group?
The slides, yes.
Okay. And do you want to talk briefly about judicature? Because I am totally aware that we're stepping on people's time a little bit. And now that we already have you on tape saying you want to do a third program, my job is done here.
I think, you know, again, will be no recap, no synthesis. I think we'll just like literally presume knowledge of the first part and the second part, right? So let me close out by saying this. So I'm bringing you back to where we started. Again, judicial temperament is a psychological construct. It's not all we want in judges. It is separable from other things that are very important about what kind of judge any given person is going to be, including intellect, training, and ideology. But this is what judicial temperament is, in my view, and this actually does give us something to work with. It's a relatively stable set of personal traits that works in dialectic with judicial environments and the demands of judging to drive behaviors that affect how justice is delivered and how it's perceived. We can work with that. So on the tip of giving you guys something to continue to work with, I'm going to be taking this rather long law review article, and if you want to read the article, God bless you. But if you would prefer something shorter, more judge-friendly, I'll be writing a punchier, shorter, more judge-friendly version for judicature, which will come out sometime in mid-2021. And I just want to thank BJI again for featuring this work and for helping me spread the word about judicial temperament.
And this is, you know, the work that Terry and I've done together has been just such a personal highlight for the last almost 10 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. But to add to that, this is exactly what BJI is about. This is why we created it, was to have these kinds of synergistic conversations between academics and judges, and to try to shed some light on what judges do and how judges live and what judges experience. And so thank you, Terry, yet again. And I think we are at time and a little bit over even. So I'm just gonna, I know that right now, particularly the people in California who are listening are dealing with some really bad stuff. And I just wish all of you well and stay safe and healthy, and same to everyone else.